You'd think the most powerful police force in the world could easily take down the mafia. The FBI had all the money, the latest technology, and the whole US government backing them up. But here's the shocking truth. Some mob bosses didn't just survive the FBI. They outsmarted the system for years. These weren't just lucky gangsters. They were clever planners who knew one big thing. The FBI had to follow strict rules. The mob didn't. FBI agents had to report to their bosses and follow the law. Mob bosses broke every rule. They bribed the people trying to catch them. They turned police informants into their own spies. Some even had FBI agents on their payroll. The craziest part? It took the FBI decades to figure out how to fight back. For years, certain bosses were untouchable. They built billion-dollar criminal empires right under the FBI's nose. This game of cat and mouse didn't always go the way you'd expect. In this video, you'll meet the most famous mafia bosses who went head-to-head with the FBI. You'll hear how they used corruption, fear, and even fake mental illness to avoid prison. Some were finally caught. Others died before justice could find them. And some conflicts that started back then are still unresolved today, hidden from public view. Section 1. John Gotti. John Joseph Gotti Jr. didn't just run the Gambino crime family. He transformed it into a media spectacle that would ultimately become his downfall. This case centers on Gotti's assassination of Paul Castellano, the 70-year-old boss of the Gambino family, and how he seized control of America's most powerful criminal organization. Gotti seemed untouchable for years, beating 3 separate federal trials and earning the nickname the Teflon Don through jury tampering and legal manipulation, before the FBI finally adapted their tactics and brought him down using surveillance, technology, and his own voice against him. Born on October 27, 1940, in the South Bronx, Gotti grew up in crushing poverty, one of 13 children in an Italian-American family that struggled to make ends meet. By the time he reached his teenage years, the streets had already claimed him. He joined a gang in East New York, Brooklyn, and began his criminal education under the mentorship of Carmine Fatico, a capo, high-ranking member, in the Gambino organization. What made Gotti different from other street thugs was not his intelligence or his strategic brilliance. It was his audacity. Gotti always wanted to be in the spotlight. He dressed in expensive suits that earned him the nickname the Dapper Don. He would always be seen at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, greeting supporters like a politician on the campaign trail. He threw massive 4th of July block parties in his Howard Beach neighborhood, buying popularity and loyalty with fireworks and free food. The FBI would later estimate these parties cost upwards of $100,000 each. But beneath the tailored suits and the public persona was a ruthless killer who had murdered his way to the top. Paul Castellano had become boss of the Gambino family through a different path entirely. He was more businessman than gangster, preferring political influence and legal businesses to street-level violence. When Castellano took over as boss, he represented everything Gotti despised about the modern mafia: cautious, calculating, avoiding the hands-on criminal operations that had built the family's power. The Gambino family under Castellano controlled labor unions, the waterfront, construction, garbage collection, and numerous legal businesses throughout New York City. The FBI estimated that the family earned over $500 million per year. The relationship between Gotti and Castellano was tense from the beginning. They rarely spoke directly, and when they did, the conversations were too formal. People who knew them both said it was only a matter of time before the conflict exploded. Early warning signs were visible to anyone paying attention. Gotti controlled a significant portion of the family's operations through his crew's activities in Queens. But he wanted more. The financial stakes were huge, and Gotti believed Castellano's cautious leadership was leaving money on the table and weakening the family's reputation. The events leading to Paul Castellano's murder began months before the actual assassination. Gotti had been growing increasingly frustrated with Castellano's leadership style and his strict rules. The boss had banned family members from involvement in drug trafficking, a prohibition that Gotti and his crew routinely violated. Drug money was simply too illegal to ignore, and Gotti didn't like being told what criminal activities he could pursue. Tensions escalated dramatically when several Gambino members were arrested on drug charges in late 1984 and early 1985. Castellano's response was swift and brutal. He wanted anyone involved in drug dealing removed from the family, either through exile or death. This put Gotti directly in his sights. His crew was heavily involved in heroin distribution, and Castellano knew it. The threat was clear and immediate. Stop dealing drugs or face deadly consequences. What really pushed Gotti to action was Castellano's decision to reorganize the family's power structure. The boss was planning to promote his own allies and sideline Gotti's group entirely. Worse, there were rumors that Castellano was considering having Gotti killed to prevent a rebellion before it could start. Whether these rumors were actually true didn't matter in the paranoid world of organized crime. Gotti believed them, and belief was enough to justify action. Gotti's state of mind during this period was a dangerous mix of ambition, paranoia, and righteous anger. He saw Castellano as weak and out of touch with the street-level operations that had built the family's fearsome reputation. He believed the other captains shared his frustration and would support a move against the boss, or at least wouldn't oppose it. Most importantly, he convinced himself that killing Castellano was not just good for his own advancement, but necessary for his survival. In the Mafia's brutal logic, it was kill or be killed. The planning was very careful and detailed, and involved multiple trusted allies. Gotti recruited Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. They identified potential shooters from among the most reliable and violent members of their crew. They began surveillance of Castellano's movements, noting his routines and patterns. The boss was careful about his security, but predictable in his habits, maintaining regular schedules that could be taken advantage of by someone paying close attention. They needed the perfect moment, a public place where Castellano would be vulnerable, but where the shooters could escape in the crowded Manhattan street. They settled on arranging a meeting at Sparks' Steakhouse, one of Manhattan's premier restaurants. Gotti told Castellano it was an important family business that required his presence. Castellano agreed, having no reason to suspect that his own captain was planning to murder him. The location was ideal. A busy street at rush hour, with multiple escape routes and enough confusion to cover the shooter's retreat. In the days before the crime, Gotti was calm and focused, having the professionalism of someone who had committed murders before. He perfectly positioned his shooters around the restaurant. He took up his own position across the street, where he could watch the hit unfold and ensure everything went according to plan. Everything was ready. All that remained was for Paul Castellano to arrive for his final dinner. December 16th, 1985, was a cold Monday evening in Manhattan. The temperature had dropped into the 30s, and darkness was gathering early as New Yorkers rushed home from work or headed out for dinner. Sparks' Steakhouse on East 46th Street, just off 3rd Avenue, was one of Manhattan's premier restaurants, known for its expensive cuts of meat and its clientele of businessmen and celebrities. The sidewalk outside was busy with pedestrians bundled against the cold, the street crowded with taxis and cars honking in the eternal symphony of rush-hour traffic. Around 5:15 in the evening, 4 men dressed in identical white trench coats and fur hats took positions near the restaurant entrance. They looked strange, standing on the busy sidewalk in their matching outfits. In the chaos of Manhattan at rush hour, with Christmas shoppers hurrying past and commuters focused on getting home, the men were noticed but not questioned. New York City in the 1980s was a place where people minded their own business, especially when something seemed slightly off. At approximately 5:25, a black Lincoln town car pulled up to the curb directly in front of Sparks. Paul Castellano, 70 years old and boss of the Gambino crime family, stepped out onto the sidewalk, followed immediately by his newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bilotti. Castellano was a large man, imposing even in his advanced age. He moved slowly, preparing to enter the restaurant for what he thought was a routine business dinner with other family members. The moment Castellano's feet touched the pavement, the four men in white moved to action. There was no hesitation, no warning, no chance for the targets to react. They had rehearsed this moment, practiced it until the movements were automatic and effortless. The first shooter raised his weapon, a semi-automatic pistol, and fired at point-blank range. The crack of gunfire shattered the evening calm, causing pedestrians to freeze in confusion and terror. Castellano was hit immediately. The bullets struck him in rapid succession, 6 shots in total to the head and torso. Witnesses would later describe the scene as surreal, almost unreal in its violence. The crack of gunshots mixed with the sounds of Christmas shoppers screaming and the squealing of car brakes as drivers reacted to the chaos. Castellano staggered, his hands reaching upward in an instinctive gesture of defense or confusion. The force of the impacts spun him partially around before he collapsed onto the sidewalk, his large body hitting the concrete with a heavy, final thud. His blood began pooling on the pavement, spreading in a dark circle around his head. Thomas Bilotti, attempting either to defend his boss or to flee to safety, lasted only seconds longer. The shooters turned their weapons on him with the same cold efficiency. He was shot 4 times and fell next to Castellano's body, the 2 men dying together on the sidewalk outside one of Manhattan's finest restaurants. The entire assassination took less than 15 seconds from the first shot to the last. The shooters didn't run. They walked away calmly, separating and disappearing into the Manhattan streets in different directions. Their matching white coats, so conspicuous moments before, now blended into the winter evening as they melted into the crowds of pedestrians. Not one of them showed any sign of haste or fear. This calculated coolness, this absolute lack of panic, demonstrated that these were professionals executing a carefully planned operation. John Gotti, 45 years old at the time, watched the entire hit from a car parked across the street. He needed to see it happen with his own eyes, needed to witness the moment when power transferred from Castellano to himself. Within minutes of Castellano's death, before the body was even cold on the sidewalk, Gotti became the boss of the Gambino family, the most powerful criminal organization in America. But Gotti had violated the mafia's most sacred rule in carrying out this hit. He had killed a boss without permission from the Commission, the governing body of New York's 5 families. The Commission existed specifically to prevent this kind of violence, to maintain order and prevent the kind of mob wars that had devastated organized crime in previous decades. The murder of Paul Castellano would set off a chain of events that would bring more of the FBI's attention to the mob and ultimately destroy John Gotti. The seeds of his downfall were planted in the same moment as his greatest triumph. The bodies were discovered immediately. It's impossible to hide 2 murders committed on a busy Manhattan street during rush hour. Dozens of witnesses had seen the shooting, though most were too traumatized or too wise to provide detailed descriptions to police. The NYPD arrived within minutes, followed quickly by FBI agents who had been monitoring Castellano as part of their ongoing investigation into organized crime. The crime scene was a law enforcement nightmare, with blood on the sidewalk, shell casings scattered around the bodies, and hundreds of potential witnesses who had already scattered into the Manhattan crowds. The FBI knew immediately that this was a mob hit. The murders, the professional precision, the targeting of a known crime boss, everything pointed to an internal mafia power struggle. Initial evidence collection focused on the physical scene. Detectives recovered shell casings and tried to track the movements of the shooters through witness interviews, but the matching white coats had been an effective disguise, making individual identification nearly impossible. Gotti's fingerprints weren't on any weapons, and he hadn't pulled any triggers personally. He had watched from across the street, insulating himself from direct physical evidence. The FBI had surveillance photographs showing Gotti in the area at the time of the murders, but that alone wasn't enough to prove he had ordered the hit. They needed witnesses willing to testify, and in the immediate aftermath of Castellano's murder, no one in the Gambino family was talking to law enforcement. The investigation quickly determined that Gotti had assumed leadership of the family after Castellano's death, a clear indication of his involvement. But knowing something and proving it in court are two different things. The FBI began building a larger case, understanding that the Castellano murder was just one piece of a much bigger criminal enterprise. Surveillance intensified. Every known associate was monitored. Every business connected to Gotti came under surveillance. For years, John Gotti seemed untouchable, despite this intense attention. Between 1986 and 1990, he was arrested and tried 3 separate times on serious federal charges. Each time, he walked free. The media dubbed him the Teflon Don. Nothing stuck to him. The first trial came in 1986, just months after Castellano's murder. Federal prosecutors charged Gotti and 6 co-defendants with racketeering, a pattern of illegal activities done as part of an organized group. The charges included gambling, loan sharking, and obstruction of justice, interfering with a police investigation. The case seemed solid, with surveillance, wiretaps, and cooperating witnesses. But when the verdict came back, Gotti was found not guilty on all counts. What the FBI didn't know at the time was that Gotti had corrupted the system from within. A Gambino associate had successfully bribed a juror with $60,000. The juror held out during deliberations, creating enough doubt to secure Gotti's acquittal. Similar jury tampering occurred in subsequent trials. But while Gotti celebrated his victories, the FBI was learning and adapting. Each acquittal only strengthened their resolve to find a way to bring him down that couldn't be defeated by bribery or intimidation. The breakthrough in building an unbeatable case against Gotti came from technology and patience. The FBI knew they needed some really strong evidence, so overwhelming that no amount of jury tampering could save him. They needed his voice on tape, admitting to murders, ordering hits, discussing what really happens inside his criminal empire. The Ravenite Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street was John Gotti's throne room, and the FBI was determined to bug it. In November 1989, acting on intelligence that Gotti was using a second-floor apartment above the club for sensitive meetings, they obtained a court order to install listening devices. The operation was extraordinarily risky. The Ravenite was occupied constantly, with Gambino soldiers hanging around at all hours. When they finally got access to the apartment, they installed multiple bugs in the ceiling and walls, hiding the devices behind paint and plaster. For months, the bugs picked up nothing useful, as Gotti seemed to sense he was being recorded. But gradually, his guard dropped, perhaps from arrogance, perhaps from stress, and John Gotti started talking. Between November 1989 and January 1990, the FBI recorded over 100 hours of conversations inside the Ravenite Social Club. What they captured was extraordinary. A masterclass in organized crime, delivered in Gotti's own words. On the tapes, Gotti discussed murders with casual indifference, including the killings of Robert DiBernardo and Louis De Bono. His voice on one tape was chilling. "He's gonna die because he refused to come in when I called." The tapes revealed his paranoia, his management style based on fear, and most damaging of all, discussions about the Castellano murder and the reorganization of the family afterward. The FBI arrested John Gotti on December 11, 1990, at the Ravenite Social Club. They also arrested Frank Locascio, his underboss, and Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, his advisor. The charges were devastating. Racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, illegal gambling, loan sharking, obstruction of justice, and 5 counts of murder, including Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti. Gotti's bail was set at $10 million. For the first time in his criminal career, John Gotti would not be able to walk the streets while awaiting trial. But the FBI needed one more piece of insurance. They needed someone from inside the family to flip, and they found him sitting in a cell next to Gotti. Salvatore Gravano, listening to the FBI tapes during discovery, heard Gotti badmouthing him, questioning his loyalty. The insult was devastating. FBI agents approached Gravano's lawyer with an offer: cooperate and receive a reduced sentence. On November 8, 1991, Salvatore Gravano officially became a cooperating witness for the United States government. When news leaked, it sent shockwaves through the underworld. If Sammy the Bull could flip, anyone could. The trial began on January 21, 1992, in federal court in Brooklyn. Judge I. Leo Glasser presided, with prosecutor John Gleason leading the government's case. The jury was anonymous, identified only by numbers, sequestered during deliberations, and transported in unmarked vehicles. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They played hours of audio tapes, letting the jury hear Gotti's voice ordering murders and running the family. But the star witness was Sammy Gravano. Over 9 days of testimony, Gravano described in detail what really happened inside the Gambino family. He explained the chain of command, the rules, the ceremonies of initiation. He described specific murders, placing Gotti at the center of every criminal conspiracy. Gravano's testimony was horrifying, delivered in a flat, matter-of-fact tone about killing people, as if describing how to fix a car. The defense tried to discredit him by highlighting his 19 admitted murders, but the strategy backfired. Gravano's willingness to admit his own crimes made him seem more credible, not less. On April 2, 1992, after only 13 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all counts. John Gotti was convicted of racketeering, 5 murders, conspiracy to commit murder, illegal gambling, loan sharking, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice. On June 23, 1992, Judge Glasser sentenced John Gotti to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the harshest sentence possible, and Glasser made his reasoning clear. In his sentencing statement, the judge said Gotti had shown no remorse, no contrition, and had lived a life of unrelenting criminality. Gotti was also ordered to pay $250,000 in fines, though everyone knew the money would never be collected. The Gambino family's assets had been frozen and seized under RICO statutes. RICO, or the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, is a law made to combat organized crime by targeting the leaders of criminal groups rather than just lower-level offenders. Frank Licasio received the same sentence: life without parole. As Gotti was led from the courtroom, he reportedly turned to his brother Peter and said, "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." But everyone in the room knew the truth. John Gotti, at 51 years old, would never see freedom again. The man who had craved the spotlight, who had transformed the Gambino family into a media spectacle, would spend the rest of his life in isolation. The impact on organized crime was immediate and devastating. The Gambino family's leadership structure was shattered. More importantly, it showed that even the most powerful mob bosses could be brought down with patience, technology, and cooperating witnesses. The fact that he switched sides in particular changed everything. If an underboss with 19 murders under his belt could flip, the code of omerta, a code of silence, was no longer absolute. The sentencing sent shockwaves through the 5 families. Other bosses saw what had happened to Gotti and understood that the old ways of operating, visible, proud, defiant, were no longer viable. The FBI had adapted and learned. The legal tools existed to destroy them. The only question was whether they would adapt fast enough to survive. Gotti was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of America's toughest maximum security facilities. He was locked alone in a cell, 23 hours a day, allowed out only for 1 hour of exercise in a small concrete yard. He had no contact with other inmates. The conditions were designed to break him, to cut him off completely from the criminal empire he had built. For a man who had thrived on attention and social interaction, the isolation was torture. Gotti's health began to deteriorate rapidly. In 1998, he was diagnosed with throat cancer, likely caused by decades of heavy smoking. The cancer spread despite treatment, spreading to his neck and head. In June 2002, as his condition worsened, he was transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. The dapper Don, who had once walked the streets of Little Italy in $2,000 suits, now spent his days in a prison hospital bed, his body weakened by disease. He died on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61. His cause of death was officially listed as complications from throat cancer. His family held a funeral in New York, and hundreds of mourners attended. The FBI maintained surveillance even at his funeral, photographing attendees and monitoring for signs of Gambino family activity. They wanted to know who still paid tribute to the dapper Don. The Gambino crime family continued after Gotti's imprisonment, though it never regained the power it held in the 1980s. Leadership passed through a series of bosses, each eventually convicted on racketeering charges. The family has been greatly weakened by RICO prosecutions, with most of its leadership in prison or dead. Today, the five families still exist in New York, but they operate in the shadows, the way organized crime traditionally did. There are no more dapper Dons holding court in social clubs, throwing block parties, or giving interviews to the press. John Gotti remains one of the most famous criminals in American history, but he remains a warning to anyone who thinks they can outsmart the government forever. While Gotti loved the spotlight and wanted everyone to know his name, another mob boss stayed in the shadows, and apparently even shared a girlfriend with the president himself. Section 2. Sam Giancana. Salvatore Giancana, known on the streets as Momo, Mooney, or simply Sam, was the boss of the Chicago outfit who fought the FBI not with courtroom theatrics, but with political connections so powerful they reached into the words. Highest levels of American government. The decades-long battle between this ruthless mob boss and the FBI would become a conflict complicated by his double role as a CIA asset. Giancana operated in the shadows for nearly 50 years, evading serious prosecution through a combination of intimidation, exile, and the protection of U.S. intelligence agencies, only to be murdered before he could reveal the full extent of government collaboration with organized crime. Born on May 24, 1908, in the Little Italy neighborhood of Chicago's near West Side, Giancana was the son of Sicilian immigrants who grew up in crushing poverty during a time when Chicago was transforming into America's most violent city. His mother died when he was young, leaving him and his siblings to be raised by a father who worked brutal hours as a pushcart operator. The Chicago that shaped Sam Giancana was a city carved up by ethnic gangs and political machines, and young men with ambition and no conscience could rise quickly. Giancana dropped out of school after 6th grade and joined a street gang called the 42 Gang. The 42 Gang was known even among Chicago's criminal element for its savagery and complete disregard for human life. By age 17, Giancana had already been arrested multiple times for auto theft, burglary, and assault. A psychological evaluation conducted during one arrest described him as a constitutional psychopath, which basically means he shows no remorse or guilt for his actions. The psychiatrist also noted that Giancana seemed incapable of empathy, an assessment that would later on prove to be true. In 1926, at age 18, Giancana was arrested for murder after shooting a man during a robbery. The case fell apart when witnesses refused to testify, intimidated into silence by threats against their families. It was Giancana's first experience with the power of fear, and he learned the lesson well. The 42 Gang worked under the Chicago outfit, the city's dominant organized crime organization, run by Tony Big Tuna Accardo and Paul the Waiter Rica, two cunning mobsters who had survived the transition from the Al Capone era. Giancana became a wheelman, a getaway driver, for the outfit's hit squads in the 1930s, before being promoted to triggerman, personally carrying out murders ordered by the bosses. Law enforcement estimated he was responsible for at least 200 deaths during his criminal career, either as the shooter or the person who ordered the hit. His specialty was the double tap, 2 bullets to the back of the head, execution style. It became his signature, a calling card that struck terror into anyone who crossed the outfit. By the late 1940s, Giancana had become a capo in the outfit, controlling illegal gambling, loan sharking, and prostitution on Chicago's South Side. He was making millions of dollars per year, money that flowed through a complex network of fake businesses that were used to hide illegal money. The FBI estimated the Chicago outfits earned over $2 billion in a year, the equivalent of more than $20 billion today. In 1957, following the arrest of several top outfit leaders, Sam Giancana was promoted to boss of the Chicago outfit at 49 years old. He controlled one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America, with influence stretching from Las Vegas to Cuba, from Hollywood to Washington, D.C. The events that would ultimately lead to Giancana's murder began building decades before the actual assassination, rooted in his expanding criminal empire and his increasingly dangerous entanglement with the U.S. government. Las Vegas in the 1950s and 1960s was the Chicago outfit's crown jewel. Giancana oversaw the outfit's interests in the Desert Inn, the Riviera, the Stardust, the Fremont, and the Tropicana. The scheme was called the Skim, which meant they would steal cash from casinos before it was counted. Their men would remove cash from casino counting rooms before it was officially counted and taxed, then bring it back to Chicago in suitcases. The FBI later estimated that between 1957 and 1963, the Chicago outfit stole between $40 to $60 million from Las Vegas casinos. Giancana personally received millions from the Skim, which he used to maintain a rich man's lifestyle that included multiple homes, expensive cars, and a wardrobe that was incomparable to any Hollywood stars. But the Vegas operation served another purpose beyond making money. The casinos were neutral meeting grounds where outfit bosses could conduct business away from FBI surveillance, offering free rooms, gambling chips, and access to prostitutes. Tensions escalated in 1960 when Giancana received an unusual visitor claiming to represent Cuban exiles with a proposition. Would the Chicago outfit be interested in helping assassinate Fidel Castro? What Giancana didn't initially know was that the Cuban exiles were actually CIA operatives. The agency, operating under direct orders from Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy, had launched Operation Mongoose with the goal of removing Castro from power. Between 1960 and 1963, Giancana coordinated at least 6 assassination attempts against Castro, all of which failed. The CIA provided technical support, weapons, and intelligence in a surreal partnership between America's top intelligence agency and one of its most wanted criminals. This created an ultimately dangerous situation for Giancana. While the FBI was building a criminal case against him for his outfit activities, the CIA was actively protecting him as an intelligence asset. The two agencies were working at cross purposes, and Giancana was playing them both. But by the early 1960s, the Mafia had become too big for even J. Edgar Hoover to ignore. Robert F. Kennedy, appointed Attorney General by his brother, President John F. Kennedy, made breaking apart the Mafia a top priority and launched an aggressive campaign against organized crime. Sam Giancana became one of Kennedy's primary targets. The FBI established a dedicated squad with the sole mission of building a case against the Chicago outfit boss, calling it Operation Top Hoodlum. The surveillance was relentless. FBI agents followed him everywhere, to restaurants, to golf courses, to his daughter's wedding. They parked outside his home in Oak Park, Illinois. They questioned his associates, his family members, even his priest. The harassment was psychological warfare designed to isolate Giancana from his criminal network and pressure him into making mistakes. On June 1, 1965, Giancana was summoned to appear before a federal grand jury investigating organized crime. Prosecutors offered him immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony. Under the law, this meant he could be compelled to testify, since he couldn't be prosecuted based on his own statements. Giancana refused to testify anyway. When prosecutors asked him questions about outfit operations, he sat silent. The judge found him in contempt of court, refusing to obey a judge's orders, and sentenced him to 1 year in federal prison. Giancana accepted the sentence rather than betray the outfit's secrets, but the contempt charge was just the beginning. Sensing the walls closing in as the FBI built evidence for a comprehensive RICO case that could put him away for life, Giancana made a critical decision. In July 1966, immediately after completing his 1-year sentence for contempt, he fled the United States. He traveled to Mexico, then various countries in South America and Europe, living in luxury apartments in Buenos Aires and traveling through Lebanon, Switzerland, and Iran. For nearly 8 years, Sam Giancana ran away from the law, living in exile while the FBI and Chicago outfit operated without him. His power within the outfit diminished with each passing year as new leaders emerged and old alliances shifted. In May 1974, Mexican authorities deported Sam Giancana back to the United States. He was 66 years old, his health failing, his power within the outfit severely diminished by years of absence. The organization he had once ruled had moved on without him. He returned to his home in Oak Park, living quietly under the watchful eyes of FBI surveillance teams that immediately resumed monitoring his activities. In 1975, the Senate formed the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, commonly known as the Church Committee, after its chairman, Senator Frank Church. The committee was made to investigate illegal activities by U.S. intelligence agencies, including domestic spying, political assassinations, and the CIA's partnerships with criminals. Sam Giancana's name appeared prominently in the committee's early research. His involvement in the CIA's Castro assassination plots made him a crucial witness who could expose the full extent of the government's collaboration with the mafia. On June 19, 1975, Giancana was summoned again to appear before the Church Committee. He was scheduled to testify about Operation Mongoose and his work with the CIA. The hearing was set for June 24, 1975. He would never make it. On the night of June 19, 1975, the same day he received the Church Committee summon, Sam Giancana was at his home in Oak Park. His usual FBI surveillance team had mysteriously been pulled off duty earlier that evening, a decision that has never been clearly explained. For the first time in months, Giancana was unwatched. Around 10 o'clock in the evening, Giancana was in his basement kitchen, apparently preparing a late-night snack. He was frying sausages on the stove, a traditional Italian dish he often made for himself. He was alone in the house. His caretaker, Joseph DiPerzio, had left for the evening. Someone entered the house through the rear entrance. That someone knew the layout of the home, knew Giancana's routines, knew he would be alone. The killer walked down to the basement kitchen and found Giancana at the stove. Sam Giancana was shot 7 times with a .22 caliber pistol equipped with a silencer. 1 bullet entered under his chin. 6 more were fired into the back of his head in a circular pattern around his mouth. Something with a hidden meaning, some investigators believed, representing Giancana's refusal to talk. The choice of weapon was significant and professional. A .22 caliber pistol is a professional's weapon for close-range assassination. The bullets don't exit the skull. They bounce around inside, destroying the brain. It's quiet, efficient, and lethal. The killer worked with the accuracy of a professional hitman. There was no struggle, no signs of panic or hurried escape. The killer left no evidence, no fingerprints, no shell casings. They were all collected. No witnesses. The execution was perfect in its brutality. The only sign of his presence was Sam Giancana's body lying on the basement floor, blood pooling around his head, the sausages still sizzling on the stove. The killer had entered and exited like a ghost, leaving behind only death and unanswered questions. Giancana's body was discovered the next morning by his daughter Francine, who had come to check on her father. She found him lying face up in a spreading pool of blood on the basement kitchen floor. The kitchen was otherwise undisturbed. Nothing had been stolen, nothing ransacked. The Oak Park Police Department immediately launched a murder investigation, but they faced an almost impossible task. Mob hits are known to be difficult to solve. The code of silence, omerta, means witnesses refuse to talk. Physical evidence is carefully cleaned up, and the hitman is usually long gone, often murdered himself to eliminate the only link to whoever ordered the kill. The FBI joined the investigation, as did Chicago Police Department detectives, but they had no shortage of suspects. Giancana had made countless enemies over his decades in organized crime. The investigation quickly developed three primary theories. Theory 1 suggested the CIA had ordered Giancana's murder to prevent him from testifying before the church committee. His testimony could have exposed illegal activities by the intelligence agency and potentially implicated high-level officials in assassination plots. The timing, killed the same day he was summoned, seemed like too much of a coincidence. The fact that FBI surveillance was pulled off on the night of the murder raised additional suspicions about government involvement. However, most serious investigators discount this theory because the CIA typically didn't commit domestic murders, especially high-profile ones that would draw massive attention. Theory 2, the one most law enforcement officials believe, suggests the Chicago outfit ordered the hit. Giancana became a big problem for the outfit. He knew where bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. He knew about corruption networks, about which politicians and judges were on the payroll, about criminal operations spanning decades. If he testified before Congress, even in closed session, he could destroy the outfit. Additionally, his years in exile had weakened his position. New leaders had emerged who saw him as a relic, a threat to their authority. Theory 3 was that it was personal. Giancana had betrayed countless people over his career. He had ordered the deaths of friends and associates. He had stolen from partners. He had slept with other men's wives, including apparently sharing a mistress with President John F. Kennedy. The list of people who wanted him dead for personal reasons was long and varied. In 2024, NBC Chicago conducted an investigation pointing to outfit enforcer Dominic "Butch" Blasi as the likely triggerman. Blasi was Giancana's driver and trusted associate, which would explain how the killer got into the house and why Giancana's guard was down. Despite decades of investigation, no one has ever been charged with Sam Giancana's murder. The case remains officially unsolved. An unsolved case that grows colder with each passing year as potential witnesses die or disappear into the Witness Protection Program. The FBI had been building a comprehensive RICO case against Giancana when he was murdered, with evidence of conspiracy to commit murder, interstate transportation of stolen property, tax evasion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and wire fraud. None of these charges ever went to trial because Giancana fled the country and was murdered before prosecutors could present their case. Unlike John Gotti, who faced a dramatic trial and life sentence, Sam Giancana never saw a day of reckoning in court. His criminal career spanned nearly 50 years, yet he was never convicted of murder or racketeering. The legal record against him is surprisingly a small list for someone of his criminal significance. In 1939, he was convicted of bootlegging and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, serving 3 years. In 1943, he was arrested for black market gasoline ration stamps during World War II, but the charges were dismissed. In 1957, Giancana was called before the McClellan Committee investigating organized crime, where he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. In 1965, he was convicted of contempt of court for refusing to testify before a federal grand jury and sentenced to 1 year in prison, a sentence he accepted rather than betray the outfit's secrets. From 1966 to 1974, he lived in exile to avoid further legal proceedings, effectively escaping American justice by leaving American jurisdiction. The absence of major trials doesn't reflect a lack of criminal activity, but rather Giancana's skill at avoiding prosecution through intimidation, corruption, and strategic flight. The FBI had been carefully building cases against him for years, but witnesses would disappear or refuse to testify. Physical evidence would vanish. Jurors would be threatened or bribed. The few times prosecutors managed to bring charges, they were relatively minor compared to the scope of Giancana's actual crimes. Giancana's body count is estimated at over 200 murders, either committed personally or ordered as boss of the Chicago outfit. Confirmed or suspected victims include William Action Jackson in 1961, an outfit loan shark suspected of being an FBI informant who was tortured for 2 days with ice picks, meat hooks, and a cattle prod before being killed. His body found hanging on a meat hook in a freezer. Leo Foreman, a real estate developer killed in 1963 for refusing to turn over property the outfit wanted. Dozens of unnamed victims whose bodies were found in car trunks, buried in construction sites, dumped in the Chicago River or Lake Michigan. The true number of people Giancana killed or ordered killed will never be known. Many murders were disguised as accidents or disappearances. Some victims were dissolved in acid or buried in remote locations where their bodies would never be found. The legal system never held him accountable for these crimes, and his murder ensured he would never face justice in an American courtroom. Because Giancana was murdered before he could stand trial for his most serious crimes, there was no sentencing in the traditional sense. The impact of his murder, however, was far-reaching, affecting both the criminal underworld and the highest levels of American government. Sam Giancana was buried on June 23, 1975, at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, in the same cemetery that holds Al Capone and other Chicago outfit legends. His funeral was a modest affair, nothing like the extravagant send-offs mob bosses typically received. The FBI photographed everyone who attended, adding their names to files that would be cross-referenced and investigated. The modest funeral reflected his diminished status within the outfit after years of exile and the dangerous knowledge he possessed at the time of his death. Giancana's death effectively ended the Church Committee's investigation into the CIA-Mafia collaboration. Without their star witness, senators had to rely on reluctant CIA officers and second-hand accounts. The full story of Operation Mongoose and other joint government mob operations may never be completely known. His family maintained his innocence of many crimes and insisted he was a real businessman persecuted by the government. His daughters wrote a book titled Double Cross, alleging their father had helped rig the 1960 presidential election in John F. Kennedy's favor by delivering votes in Chicago, only to be betrayed when Robert F. Kennedy launched his war on organized crime. The Kennedy connection remains one of the most intriguing aspects of Giancana's story. The alleged relationship between the mob boss and President Kennedy through their shared mistress, Judith Campbell Exner, has been the subject of countless books and documentaries. Whether Giancana actually helped Kennedy win the presidency is disputed by historians. But the connection between America's political elite and organized crime during this era is undeniable and deeply troubling. The Chicago outfit continued operating after Giancana's death, though it never regained the power it held during his reign. Federal RICO prosecutions in the 1980s and 1990s weakened the organization's leadership. Today, the outfit still exists, but operates in the shadows like most of the organized crime groups. For the FBI, Giancana represented a failure that haunted the agency for decades. Despite years of surveillance, despite mountains of evidence, despite knowing he was responsible for hundreds of murders, they never successfully prosecuted him for his most serious crimes. Sam Giancana's story is unique among mob bosses because of his entanglement with the U.S. government. While other crime leaders spent their careers evading federal authorities, Giancana both worked for and against them. He was both a criminal and government asset, murderer and intelligence operative. This double role raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of American power during the Cold War. Today, Sam Giancana is remembered as one of the most powerful and ruthless mob bosses in American history. He controlled an empire that stretched from Chicago to Las Vegas to Cuba. He worked with the CIA on assassination plots while simultaneously being hunted by the FBI. And in the end, he died the way he had lived, violently, mysteriously, with secrets intact. The man who knew too much took those secrets to his grave, leaving behind only questions, theories, and a body count that will never be fully tallied. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover organized crime history like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. While Giancana hid in the shadows, another mob boss faked being crazy for almost 30 years to fool the FBI. Section 3. Vincent Gigante. Vincent Louis Gigante was the boss of the Genovese crime family who fought the FBI not with violence or political connections, but with one of the most complicated and sustained deceptions in organized crime: history. Pretending to be mentally ill for nearly 30 years, Gigante successfully evaded prosecution for decades by fooling psychiatrists, judges, and law enforcement into believing he lacked the mental capacity to stand trial, all while secretly running the most powerful and disciplined crime family in New York. His eventual conviction and admission of the fraud demonstrated how the FBI finally adapted to defeat even the most cunning adversary. Born on March 29, 1928, in Manhattan's Lower East Side, Vincent Gigante was the youngest of 5 brothers in a family of Italian immigrants. His father, Salvatore Gigante, worked as a jeweler and watchmaker, struggling to provide for his large family during the Great Depression. The Gigantes lived in a cramped apartment where young Vincent shared a bedroom with his brothers, learning early that survival meant fighting for everything you got. As a teenager, Gigante showed promise as a boxer, fighting under the name The Chin, a nickname derived from his mother's affectionate Italian term, Vincenzo Cinzerel. He compiled a record of 21 wins and 4 losses as a professional light heavyweight between 1944 and 1947. He had powerful hands and decent footwork, but lacked the killer instinct needed to reach championship level. Boxing scouts noted that Gigante seems to hold back in the ring, as if he couldn't commit fully to hurting his opponents. That restraint would disappear completely when Gigante entered organized crime. By his early 20s, Gigante had caught the attention of Vito Genovese, the ruthless boss of one of New York's 5 families. Genovese saw potential in the young former boxer: intelligence, loyalty, and most importantly, the capacity for violence when properly motivated. Gigante was inducted into the Genovese family in the early 1950s, starting as a soldier and working his way up through the ranks by proving himself capable of the mafia's most essential task: murder. On the evening of May 2, 1957, Vincent Gigante received an order that would define the rest of his life. Vito Genovese wanted Frank Costello eliminated. Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, was the current boss, a sophisticated operator who preferred political influence and legal business to violence. But Genovese believed power came from fear, and fear came from bullets. Gigante, then 29 years old, was chosen to be the triggerman. The assassination attempt failed spectacularly. When Costello entered his apartment building lobby around 11 in the evening, Gigante emerged from the shadows and fired a single shot from a .38 caliber revolver. Costello turned his head at the sound of his name, and the bullet grazed his scalp rather than killing him. Gigante fled, convinced he had completed his assignment, but Costello survived. Police found Gigante's fingerprints and arrested him within days, but Costello refused to identify his attacker, and the charges were dropped. The experience taught Gigante 2 crucial lessons that would shape his entire criminal career. First, murder was the ultimate tool of power in the mafia. Second, the legal system could be manipulated if you understood its weaknesses. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Gigante rose through the Genovese family ranks. He became a capo, controlling illegal money-making rackets in labor unions, particularly the International Longshoremen's Association, which controlled the New York waterfront. The FBI estimated his criminal activities generated over $100 million annually. In the late 1960s, Gigante began exhibiting strange behavior that would evolve into his legendary three-decade deception. He would wander the streets of Greenwich Village in his bathrobe and pajamas, muttering to himself. He shuffled rather than walked, his head down, his shoulders hunched. Neighbors reported seeing him urinating in the street. He appeared disheveled, confused, and mentally unstable. His family claimed he was suffering from severe mental illness. In 1969, Gigante checked himself into St. Vincent's Hospital for psychiatric evaluation, where doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia and depression, which were both serious mental illnesses. To anyone watching, and the FBI was definitely watching, Vincent Gigante appeared to be a broken man, destroyed by mental illness, incapable of running a criminal empire. It was all an act. The Crazy Act, as it became known. He fooled psychiatrists, judges, journalists, and even some members of law enforcement. The bathrobe and pajamas became his costume. The mumbling and shuffling became his performance. The psychiatric hospitalizations provided official documentation that he was genuinely mentally ill. Behind the fake appearance he put up, Gigante was running the Genovese family with iron discipline. In 1981, when boss Philip Funzi Thierry died, the family's ruling panel chose Gigante as the new boss. He was 53 years old and at the height of his powers. Under his leadership, the Genovese family became the most powerful and secretive of New York's 5 families. As boss, Vincent Gigante, now mockingly called the Odd Father by the press, implemented strict rules designed to protect the family from law enforcement. He banned members from speaking his name. Associates referred to him as the Chin, or simply touched their chin when discussing him. He forbade the use of the words mob, mafia, or Cosa Nostra in conversations. More significantly, Gigante ordered that all meetings take place while walking. He understood that the FBI was using sophisticated surveillance technology to bug apartments, social clubs, and vehicles. But it was far more difficult to record a conversation between 2 people walking on a busy New York street. The Genovese family under Gigante controlled operations that generated over $400 million every year. Through the International Longshoremen's Association, they controlled shipping and cargo handling at New York and New Jersey ports. They controlled concrete suppliers, labor unions, and construction contracts throughout New York City, including deals related to Trump Tower. They controlled garbage collection, creating a group that overcharged businesses. They dominated the Javits Center convention facility. The FBI calculated that Gigante personally received $10 to $15 million annually as the boss's cut. He used this money carefully. Unlike flashy bosses like John Gotti, Gigante maintained his crazy persona publicly. He lived modestly, at least in appearance. He collected government disability checks for his supposed mental illness. He appeared broke to outside observers, but privately, he owned properties in New York and New Jersey. He maintained a mistress in a separate apartment, fathering several children with her while remaining legally married to his wife. He controlled a fortune, estimated at over $30 million by the time of his arrest. By the early 1990s, the FBI had spent decades trying to build a case against Vincent Gigante. They knew he was the boss. They had informants who confirmed it. They had surveillance photographs showing him meeting with known mobsters, but they couldn't prove he was actually running criminal operations, because every time they tried to arrest him, his lawyers produced psychiatric evaluations showing he was not in his right mind. In 1990, Gigante was accused of racketeering charges, but the case was postponed for years while doctors argued about his mental state. Vincent Gigante's ongoing fraud against the American legal system that lasted nearly 3 decades. While he certainly ordered and approved numerous murders during his reign as boss, The FBI documented at least 7 murders between 1986 and 1990 that Gigante ordered or approved. The trick itself became his signature criminal act. Every shuffling walk through Greenwich Village was a performance calculated to reinforce the lie. Every mumbled conversation was carefully crafted to seem incoherent, while actually maintaining his iron grip on the Genovese family. Every psychiatric hospitalization was a strategic move to create documentation supporting his claims of incompetence. A deception that lasted this long was never done before in American criminal history. Gigante's fraud operated on multiple levels simultaneously. He fooled court-appointed psychiatrists who examined him for competency hearings, presenting symptoms that mimicked genuine schizophrenia and dementia. He fooled judges who reviewed his case, creating enough medical documentation and expert testimony to delay trials for years. He fooled the media, which covered The Odd Father as a tragic figure, rather than a calculating criminal mastermind. Most impressively, he maintained this act while secretly running every aspect of the Genovese family's operations. The murders Gigante ordered during this period were carried out with the same careful, exact planning as his mental illness act. John Johnny Coca-Cola Lardiere, a Genovese soldier suspected of being an informant, was shot to death in the Bronx in 1986 on Gigante's orders. The message was clear. Betrayal meant death, regardless of how crazy the boss appeared to be. Witnesses would later testify that Gigante personally approved these murders during his walk and talk meetings, using code words like, "He's got to go," or "Take care of it," to order executions. The criminal enterprise Gigante ran while pretending to be mentally ill was vast and sophisticated. The window replacement scheme alone defrauded New York City public housing of millions of dollars. They took control of labor unions, which gave the family control over strikes, work stoppages, and pension funds that could be stolen. The waterfront operations generated $30 million annually. Every major construction project in New York City paid tribute to the Genovese family. The FBI's investigation of Vincent Gigante represented a fundamental challenge to law enforcement. How do you investigate and prosecute someone who appears too mentally ill to understand the charges against him? The Bureau had been watching Gigante since the 1960s, but his Insanity Act created a legal shield that seemed impenetrable. Traditional investigative techniques, surveillance, wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, all confirmed that Gigante was running the Genovese family. But his lawyers could always produce psychiatric experts claiming he was incompetent to stand trial. The breakthrough came when the FBI decided to focus not just on building a criminal case, but on proving the mental illness was a fraud. They launched Operation Windows, ostensibly investigating the window replacement industry that the Genovese family controlled. But the operation went far deeper, examining the family's entire criminal structure and Gigante's role in running it. The FBI needed to catch Gigante being clear-minded, competent, and clearly in command when he thought no one was watching. Wiretaps and cooperating witnesses provided crucial evidence. While Gigante himself was careful never to discuss business on phones or in locations that could be easily bugged, his subordinates were not always so cautious. The FBI recorded hundreds of hours of conversations between Genovese captains and soldiers, discussing how orders came from Gigante, how profits flowed to him, and how he made final decisions on family matters. Peter Savino, a Genovese associate who operated a window replacement company, became a cooperating witness in 1993. And wore a wire to record conversations about how Gigante controlled the entire industry. But the most damaging evidence came from visual surveillance. FBI agents installed cameras near Gigante's Sullivan Street townhouse and his mother's apartment building. What they captured contradicted everything his lawyers claimed about his mental state. The surveillance footage showed Gigante walking normally when he thought no one was watching. His shuffle disappeared. His posture straightened. He engaged in clear, coherent conversations with associates about family business, who should be promoted, how to handle disputes, which operations needed attention. In one particular piece of video from December 1995, Gigante was captured walking with Genovese captain Dominic Quiet Dom Cirillo through Greenwich Village. The two men discussed family politics in detail, with Gigante giving orders and making decisions about criminal operations. The FBI now had everything they needed: cooperating witnesses, wiretaps, surveillance footage, and financial records showing the family's criminal enterprises. On June 25, 1997, Vincent Gigante was arrested at his Sullivan Street townhouse and charged with racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and operating a criminal enterprise. He was 69 years old, and his 30-year act was finally over. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Gigante maintained his confused persona even as FBI agents read him his rights and led him away in handcuffs, shuffling and mumbling as if he didn't understand what was happening. Vincent Gigante's trial was held in federal court in Brooklyn, with Judge Jack B. Weinstein presiding, and prosecutor Andrew Weissman leading the government's case. Before the trial could even begin, however, there was the critical matter of Gigante's competency. His defense team filed motions arguing that Gigante was mentally unfit to stand trial, producing psychiatric evaluations from multiple doctors, claiming he suffered from dementia, schizophrenia, and organic brain syndrome that left him unable to understand legal proceedings. Judge Weinstein ordered an independent psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Stanley Portnow examined Gigante extensively and reached a crucial conclusion. While Gigante may have had some mental health issues, he was exaggerating his symptoms and was competent to stand trial. The judge ruled the trial would proceed, rejecting the defense's latest attempt to use Gigante's supposed mental illness as a shield against prosecution. This decision was a turning point. For the first time in decades, Gigante would have to face criminal charges in court rather than hiding behind psychiatrists' reports. The prosecution built their case around three main charges, showing how Gigante controlled the Genovese family. They showed how Gigante ran the Genovese family as a criminal enterprise from 1981 through 1997. Prosecutors presented testimony from cooperating witnesses who described the family's structure, how orders flowed from Gigante to captains to soldiers, and how profits flowed back up to the boss. Peter Savino testified about the window scheme, explaining how Gigante personally approved which companies could operate and how much they would pay in tribute, defrauding New York City public housing of millions of dollars. The conspiracy to commit murder charges focused on 7 murders Gigante ordered or approved between 1986 and 1990, including Johnny Coca-Cola Lardiere, and the attempted murder of Peter Savino. Cooperating witnesses testified that Gigante personally approved these murders during walk and talk meetings using clear code words. The use of the labor union to commit crimes demonstrated how Gigante corrupted labor unions, particularly the International Longshoremen's Association, Local 1804-1. George Barone, former head of the union, testified that he had to get Gigante's approval for every major union decision. But the most dramatic evidence was the surveillance footage. Jurors watched video of Gigante walking normally, talking clearly, and discussing business. Then they watched footage from court appearances where Gigante shuffled, mumbled, and appeared confused. Here was visual proof that the mental illness was a performance. Defense attorneys argued the government was persecuting a sick old man, claiming Gigante had good days and bad days that explained the discrepancy in his behavior. They suggested the surveillance footage was selectively edited to make him appear more competent than he actually was. They attacked the credibility of cooperating witnesses, pointing out that many were admitted murderers who had received reduced sentences in exchange for testimony. But at this point, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning on July 25, 1997, with guilty verdicts on all counts. Vincent Gigante was convicted of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and labor racketeering. The courtroom was packed with journalists, law enforcement officials, and spectators who had followed the case. Gigante showed no reaction to the verdict, maintaining his act even in defeat, sitting slumped in his chair and staring at the floor. On December 18, 1997, Judge Weinstein sentenced Vincent Gigante to 12 years in federal prison and fined him $1,250,000. While not a life sentence, it was effectively one for a 69-year-old man in poor health. The judge noted that Gigante had shown utter ruthlessness in running the Genovese family and had corrupted institutions that were supposed to serve the public good. The sentencing represented a major victory for the FBI. But that was not the end of Gigante's legal troubles. Federal prosecutors filed additional charges in 2002 while Gigante was appealing his conviction, accusing him of ordering the attempted murder of John Gotti in 1986 and other murders. These charges carried potential life sentences. Facing the likelihood of dying in prison and confronted with new evidence that could result in life without parole, Vincent Gigante made a stunning decision that would shock the legal world and prove right to every FBI agent who had suspected them. Truth for 3 decades. On April 7, 2003, Gigante appeared in federal court in Brooklyn for a hearing on the new murder charges. For the first time in nearly 30 years, he dropped the act completely. Gigante stood before Judge George B. Daniels and admitted the truth that everyone had suspected, but he had never acknowledged. He had faked mental illness for decades to avoid prosecution. The bathrobe, the shuffling, the mumbling, all of it had been a performance designed to manipulate the legal system. "I am mentally competent and ready to proceed with this case," Gigante said clearly, his voice strong and his posture erect. This was not the confused, rambling man who had appeared in courtrooms for years. When Judge Daniels asked him directly, "For years you have pretended to be mentally ill. Was this a sham?" Gigante replied simply, "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted as journalists scrambled to file stories, and FBI agents allowed themselves satisfied smiles. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice, the crime of faking insanity to avoid prosecution. In exchange, federal prosecutors agreed to add only 3 years to his existing sentence, meaning he would serve a total of 15 years rather than face a potential life sentence on the murder charges. By admitting the act, Gigante destroyed whatever sympathy he might have generated. He had made a mockery of the criminal justice system and of people who genuinely suffered from mental illness. The legacy he left was not of a clever criminal, but of a man who had lied for so long that nothing about him could be trusted. If you enjoyed this deep dive into notorious mafia bosses who fought with the FBI, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.